Some of you may be thinking, yeah, well, I did put a plan on paper, and there's still questions I can't answer, and so obviously this is just not a vision from the Lord. Basically, what you're doing is you're letting the question of what God has called you to do die over the question of how it is that you're going to get it done. And for this series, I've been reading a book by Andy Stanley. Andy Stanley is a pastor at North Point Community Church in Atlanta, Georgia. And in his book, Visioneering, he has a little saying. And you ever been reading a book and you read something and it just sticks with you? And it kind of sticks with you for a very long time? This is one of those statements. And the statement was, you should never let the question of what God has called you to do die over the question of how to get it done. Because if it's truly a vision from God, then God-sized visions always have a how, but they seldom have the how. You seldom know how to answer all the how questions at the very beginning. In fact, if you have a vision from the Lord and you know how to get everything done and you can answer all the how questions, it very well may not be a vision from the Lord, because visions from the Lord don't have all the how questions answered. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, because sometimes we got good ideas and we should just do those ideas. But I'm talking about a God-sized vision, a God-sized task for your life. Seldom does it have all the how questions answered. Seldom do you know how it is that you're going to raise the money. Seldom do you know how it is that you're going to build the building. Seldom do you know how you're going to sponsor all these missionaries all around the world. Seldom do you know how you're going to have the money to finish school, or to have a spouse who actually thinks you're good looking. Or seldom do you know how to do all those things that seem unreachable, unapproachable. God has a how. So what you got to do is take all the how questions that you can answer and answer them, and then sit back and wait and watch God do the rest. If Moses would have let the question of how kill the question of what, he would have never led Israel to cross the Red Sea. I mean, right? If David would have let the question of how kill the question of what God had called him to do, he would have never become king. God tells David, you're going to be a king forevermore. And yet David's running around in the wilderness, running from Saul, who's trying to kill him. He didn't have all the how questions answered, but God had a how. The disciples would have never seen Jesus feed the 5,000 if they let the question of what die over the question of how. Paul would have never planted churches all over the known world if he would have let the question of how kill the question of what. What has God called you to do? What is the burden that He's put in your life? You've got a big what. Maybe it's a child you need to adopt. Maybe you're getting into foster care. Maybe it's a parent, a very sick parent. Maybe it's a spouse. Maybe it's a marriage problem. Maybe it's there's 1,001 reasons that we could have a what. God gives us a burden. Maybe it's an unreached people group in India. Whatever the what is, don't let the question of what be killed by the question of how. Just because you don't know how to get it done doesn't mean God doesn't know how to get it done, and it doesn't mean that you need to let the vision die. Nehemiah didn't know all the questions. He didn't know how to answer all the questions of how, but he trusted the Lord. He did what he could do, and then he sat back and said, Lord, I don't know how to do the rest, but I'm entrusting you to do so. And one of the reasons God does that is so that at the end of the day, when our vision is accomplished, we're able to sit back and look at what God did and say, wow, isn't God good? Look at what God did. So never let the question of how kill the question of what. Leverage the downtime for the sake of the vision. That's what some of us need to be reminded of.